My first book was a history of Indigenous people in Seattle, which is my hometown, and it looked at how urban and Indigenous histories connect to each other and how they're not mutually exclusive, but they actually create each other. They're mutually constitutive. And when that book came out in 2007, a friend of mine who was from London said, kind of jokingly, well, you should write a book like that about London. And I kind of laughed it off at first, and then I thought, within about 10 minutes, I realized, that's actually a great idea. Nobody's really tried to write an Indigenous-centered history of the center of empire before. What would that even look like? So it kind of came out of an offhanded conversation, but sometimes that's where the best ideas come from. The most well-known traveler probably is Pocahontas, who died in England in 1617, so just 400 years ago now. And she came as part of a delegation of Powhatan men and women who came basically to kind of explore what the English were about, what their culture was like, what their goals were with colonization and so on. So when she was there, she was an enormous celebrity. She was much written about, much commented upon, crowds of people trying to get in to look at her. She was seen at court. And she really changed public opinion around colonization in many ways. And so one of the things I'm trying to argue with the book is that the presence of Indigenous people in London helped Londoners learn how to be colonial. And she is a really good example of that. And she's really the only figure that people kind of still remember today. Much of this history has been forgotten, but often when I talk about this project, people will say, oh, right, like Pocahontas, and that's kind of the one touchstone for them. I think one of the main themes that comes across in all the accounts that we have by Indigenous people, which are not many, often we have to kind of read between the lines to see what people thought of their experience there, but there are sort of two themes that come across in terms of what Indigenous people thought of the city. One is that they tended to be really critical of the disparities of wealth that they saw in the city, the differences between the rich and the poor. And there's a real sense of being shocked at that they would never let that happen in their own culture, their own society, and so on. And then the other critique that you see is a critique of the ecology of the city, where how these people feed themselves. There's nothing here to hunt, nobody knows how to hunt, and that's actually a really salient issue for much of London's urban history, is how does the city feed itself? How could it be at all sustainable? And so Indigenous people in both cases are really catching the big issues of urban life, which are wealth and food. And so you get a sense of, instead of Indigenous people being confused by the metropolis or somehow incapable of understanding it, they in fact see exactly what's going on. I like to think about the Indigenous visitors to London serving almost as mirrors for the English. The English see themselves reflected in these strangers that come to their city. And so you see things like, for example, a gang in 1712 who was committing a lot of acts of violence in the city. They call themselves the Mohawks, which tells us all kinds of ideas, or all kinds of things, not so much about the Mohawk people, but about the English people and what they think, their ideas about savagery and freedom and liberty and all these kinds of complicated ideas. And there are lots of other moments where Indigenous visitors actually encourage Londoners to think about themselves in new ways, whether it's conflicts over class dynamics, or ideas about gender, or ideas about the body in suburban spaces. There's all these kinds of moments where English people are sort of seeing themselves refracted through these Indigenous bodies and minds that are often on display in their city. So the book is structured with 7 kind of traditional chapters, and then in between the chapters are 6 interludes, and these are free verse poems built out of archival fragments, so bits and pieces that I came across in the archives. And the idea here was to build each one around an object in the city. So there's a mirror, a debtor's petition, a statue, a lost museum, a hat factory, and a notebook. And the goal was, unlike the chapters, which really focus on Indigenous agency and the ability of Indigenous people to have some control over their experiences in the city, these 6 interludes really try to capture the human costs of empire. And so they're also designed to kind of have a more affective relationship between the reader and the text, a little bit more evocative, a little bit less didactic, and really a chance for the reader to say, okay, this is what this meant for actual human lives. I think that Britain is still really struggling with the memory of empire. There's a sense of almost amnesia about the empire, or a sense of disavowal, or a sense of triumphalism that the empire was a good thing. And so I think that Britain is still kind of struggling with this, and anytime we can take a story like Indigenous London and really take something that people think they know, like the history of the city, and come at it from a really radically different angle, can kind of shake up and disorient that sense of imperial certainty, and really kind of challenge those notions of superiority, that the empire was without cost. So one of the goals, I think, of Indigenous studies more generally is to make the Indigenous world as big as possible, culturally, politically, legally, intellectually, and so on. And so what I'm really trying to do with this project is really expand the framework for how we can think about Indigenous studies and where Indigenous history really begins and belongs. And one of those places is London.